Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's get week 60 of today's Tolkien Times going with another Middle-earth Map Monday. Now, ever since I started Middle-earth Map Mondays back in July, we've been bouncing around the northwest of Middle-earth. We started with what looked like following in Frodo and Friends' footsteps as we covered the Shire, the Old Forest, the Barrow Downs, and Bree. But after that, I took a break to look at Lindon and the Grey Havens, and then I sort of went on this historical spree, covering the capitals of Arnor, Annúminas, and Fornost, as well as the successor kingdoms, and even Forochel, where Arvedwi, last king of Arthedain, died. Now today, I want to return to tracing the steps of Strider and the Hobbits, as we take stops at Amon Sul and the Trollshaws today, before we eventually arrive next week in Rivendell. Now first, I'm going to go ahead and read a few lines from A Knife in the Dark, Chapter 11 of Book 1 of The Lord of the Rings. As Strider and the hobbits get through the last bits of the Midgewater marshes, away in the distance eastward, they could now see a line of hills. The highest of them was at the right of the line and a little separated from the others. It had a conical top, slightly flattened at the summit. "That is Weathertop," said Strider. So there's a start. Now, as they were approaching Weathertop from the north later on, they found a path, and Merry wonders who made it and why. He says it has a barrow-whitish look. And Strider explains, the men of the west did not live here, though in their latter days they defended the hills for a while against the evil that came out of Angmar. This path was made to serve the forts along the walls. But long before, in the first days of the North Kingdom, they built a great watchtower on Weathertop. Amon Sul, they called it. It was burned and broken, and nothing remains of it now but a tumbled ring, like a rough crown on the old hill's head. Yet once it was tall and fair. It is told that Elendil stood there, watching for the coming of Gil-galad out of the west in the days of the last alliance. Now, Weathertop is its name in the common speech, but you'll also recall its Sindarin name, Amon Sul. Amon, of course, is a singular noun meaning hill, like Amon Hen. Now, its plural is Emin, as in the Emin Muil. Sul is Sindarin for wind, and it's the same element we see in Manwe's Quenya epithet Manwe Sulimo, Lord of the Winds. The hill sits at the south end of a north-south range of hills called the Weather Hills in the middle of Eriador, between the Breeland and the River Horwell. Now, we've talked about both the Weather Hills and Weathertop in weeks 57 and 58, as we talked about the three successor kingdoms after the split of Arnor. The hills formed the border between Arthedain and Rhudaur, while Cardolan was on the south side of the road, and thus Weathertop was right where all three kingdoms came together. But that's in the Third Age. What about Weathertop in older times? I mean, after all, Strider mentions how they built the watchtower in the first days of the North Kingdom. Now, that's not Arthedain, but Arnor itself, since he mentions Elendil standing in the tower watching for the arrival of Gil-galad before their defeat of Sauron. But what about earlier than that? Well, in Unfinished Tales in the story of Eldarion and Erendis, we read about Eldarion's grandfather, Veantur, the captain of the king's ships, and how he, when Eldarion was turning 25, invited him to join him on a venture to Middle-earth, where they would be welcomed by both Círdan and Gil-galad. Now, the footnote to that part of the story includes a description of the first meeting of those Númenóreans with the men of Eriador. And while the details of that meeting are fantastic and well worth the read, we don't have the time for the whole thing. What we do have time for is to explain that these middlemen dwelt about Lake Evendim in the North Downs and the Weather Hills, and in the lands between as far as the Brandywine, west of which they often wandered, though they did not dwell there. Then, in Peoples of Middle-earth, in Of Dwarves and Men, we get the rest of that information. It was long before the Númenórean settlers about the mouths of Anduin ventured north of their great haven at Pelargir and made contact with men who dwelt in the valleys on either side of the White Mountains. Their term middlemen was thus originally applied to men of Eriador, the most westerly of mankind in the Second Age, and known to the elves of Gil-galad's realm. At that time, there were many men in Eriador, mainly, it would seem in origin, kin of the folk of Beor, though some were kin of the folk of Hador. And then the text says what it said in the footnote in Unfinished Tales about them living near Lake Evendim and the Weather Hills. So these hills weren't just occupied by Númenóreans in exile in the Kingdom of Arnor. They'd also been the home of middlemen long before that, mostly the folk of Beor, but some from the folk of Hador. Now, as for the path and the forts that Strider mentions, those likely date to the reign of Argelab I, the seventh king of Arthedain, between 1349, when he came to power, and 1356, when he died in battle with Rhudaur. Now, the tower only lasted until 1409, when the Witch King destroyed it and killed Argelab's son, King Arvedek. Now, while we'll get to Rivendell next week, there is just enough time this week to mention the Trollshaws, a forested upland area between the Horwell and the Loudwater just to the west of Rivendell. You recall that the Horwell, or Mithaithil, was the westernmost of those two rivers. That was the one crossed using the last bridge, while the Loudwater, or Bruinen, was crossed by a ford instead. In the book, the Trollshaws are described as a somber country of dark trees winding among the feet of sullen hills, as well as threatening and unfriendly. Now, the hobbits would catch glimpses of ancient walls of stone and the ruins of towers. When Frodo asked about the land and the towers, Strider explained that men once dwelt here ages ago, but none remain now. They became an evil people, as legends tell, for they fell under the shadow of Angmar. But all were destroyed in the war that brought the North Kingdom to its end. Now, you remember that this region was part of the kingdom of Rhudaur. That was the one that fell to Angmar before Arthedain and Cardolan. They are the ones who would have built those threatening and unfriendly towers. Of course, the forest was also home to caves, often used by trolls, as Bilbo and his companions discover on the quest of Erebor. Now we're all set up to cross the Ford of Bruinen. Come on down, get your next car at Ford of Bruinen, and then arrive at the last homely house in Rivendell next week. Folks, that wraps it up for Middle-earth Map Monday. But if you have a mailbag question that you'd like me to answer in Series 9, please email it to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Send it in and let them know it's for today's Tolkien Times. I'll get to it as soon as possible, with priority going to supporters of the show on Patreon. I'm grateful for the support of my patrons. They're the ones who make it possible for me to put in the time and resources that it takes to produce these episodes. Now, if you'd like to be a part of that, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to find out how you can join the Content Council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday, as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe on podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.